Oh, close as possible.
Yeah.
Will the collar mess it up or?
We're ready to go. Okay.
How far I got?
Hi everyone, welcome to the Action Committee for Transit December meeting. This is our last membership meeting of the year. And so before we get started with our guest speaker, we have a couple of announcements. First, we are hiring a full-time organizer, which is very exciting. The job description is listed on our website. And so if you or someone you may know would be a good fit for this role, please check out our website, actfortransit.org, and check out the job description and send it to folks you may know who could be good for this role. Second announcement is that Ben Ross will announce the nominating committee announcement for the slate for the next board for 2023. And so, Ben, would you like to make that announcement?
Okay. The nominating committee report is that we nominate for the new president after thanking Paul Goldman for a few years of very good service. We are nominating Amy Frieder. For treasurer, Nick Brand is returning. Matthew assisting, working with Nick on the finances as Nick. Then for the three vice presidents, Miriam Schoenbaum with responsibility for pedestrian and bicycle, Sean Robertson with responsibility for our online activities, and James Hedrick with responsibility for housing, who can't be there because apparently I just saw a tweet with a line on a COVID test from his house. As the other two board members, Sunil Dasgupta, in charge of meeting programs, and Chris Farrell as our liaison on highway widening with Don't Widen 270 and Citizens Against Beltway expansion. And then, in addition, not a board member, but will be invited to meetings of the board and will be coordinating our activities on mark expansion will be John Gorman from Takoma Park, or currently living in D.C. but still a Marylander at heart. So let me turn it back to Amy to see if there are any more nominations.
Okay, so I guess if there are any more nominations for the nominating committee. Going once, going twice. Okay, moving on to other announcements. If you haven't signed in, please sign in. We have a sign-in sheet at the back with Kathy. And then we also have, I'm sorry? Oh, and then we're going to go around and introduce ourselves. So please state your name and where you're from, and then we'll move on to our guest speaker. So would you like to start?
Sure. I'm Graham Reed. I live in Silver Spring.
Would you like to go next?
Andrew Dashner, Silver Spring.
Ben Ross, Bethesda.
Mike Larkin, Silver Spring, but half the week in Bethesda. John Wetmore, Bethesda. Sinead Bescup, Aspen Hill.
Lori Willows, Takoma first.
Chandler, Silver Spring. Bill Bruno, Silver Spring. Chris Farrell, Kent Mill.
Sylvia Tagliani, Silver Spring. Benita Vivadanza, Silver Spring. Kevin Jones, Silver Spring.
Okay, great. Thank you all for being here and staying masked and coming in person. Our meetings are live streamed on Facebook, and we also upload them to YouTube. So if you don't already, please follow ACT's YouTube page. We're trying to make it to 100 subscribers so that we can, benefit from the special branding. Okay, so moving on to our guest speaker, DARYL Braithwaite, is that correct? Has been the Public Works Director for the City of Takoma Park for the last 10 years and has worked in various facilities management positions for the city since 1989, including Recycling Coordinator and Solid Waste Manager. She was the project manager for the Flower Avenue Sidewalk project that started in 2014 and was completed in 2021. So please join me in a warm welcome for DARYL.
Thanks. Thanks. Great. Thank you all. I appreciate being here. I look forward to talking with you and providing a brief presentation. I've got a couple of things I wanted to speak about tonight. Some of you may have heard Sunil and I did one of his podcast shows that focused on the Flower Avenue Green Street project. And there's a couple of other additional items that I wanted to add. Based on my rough timing, I think we've got about 20 minutes presentation and then 20 minutes of questions. So I've only run through it once, so hopefully it won't take too long and I'll move it along. Much of this I could be happy to send you electronically, remotely, so that some of the details you can capture through that. Tonight I'm going to talk briefly again, touch base on the Flower Avenue Green Street project the city completed, and then go into the ADA sidewalk compliance program that the city does, as well as our new sidewalk process. So apologies for swinging back and forth. I know you're looking at it here, I'm looking at it there. Some overview of the Flower Avenue Green Street project. As you can see from the picture, the Flower Avenue Green Street is about a 1-mile section of roadway that runs from Carroll Avenue to University Boulevard, or Piney Branch Road, and it's the northeast boundary for the city. So it presented some interesting challenges, primarily being that it was kind of a no man's land. It was the edge of the city, the edge of the county, and the roadway itself was owned by State Highway. So it meant that nobody really paid attention to it or addressed any of the myriad of concerns that was developed as a result of that project. So it's a 1-mile long street. It's a 2-lane road. It's an arterial. The posted speed was 25 miles an hour, but from State Highway's own evaluation, the 85th percentile, if you're familiar with that frame of reference, was 35 miles an hour. So cars were averaging well over the posted speed limit on the street. It had on-street parking on one side. The road itself was about 28 feet wide. It was the split right-of-way, as I mentioned. We were able to, the State Highway agreed to transfer the right-of-way ownership to the city in 2012 through a fairly legal and formal process. That 1-mile section was no longer contiguous to the rest of Flower Avenue, both to the north and south. So for the State Highway Administration, it was really no longer considered part of their network, so they really wanted to shed it. So the benefit for us was they agreed, if we agreed to take it, they agreed to give us the money that they were planning to spend on resurfacing the road. We also worked with Montgomery County because, as I mentioned, one side of the street was the city, the road itself was the state, the other side of the street was Montgomery County right-of-way. So we were able to work with Montgomery County. They ceded us the right-of-way, so the city became the owner of the entire right-of-way of that 1-mile section and could therefore sort of plan effectively for how to best address traffic concerns, pedestrian concerns, and transit concerns on the road. There was only a sidewalk on the west side of the street, what we call the city side. There was no sidewalk on the east side. There was a little asphalt kind of billy goat trail, but it was inconsistent and very hazardous. And as I mentioned before, cars are racing by as well as buses at 35 miles an hour. It was a really dangerous road if you were trying to walk on it. We also had the issue as we were moving into design of a varied right-of-way. Some portions of the section of the roadway were the right-of-way was 15 feet behind the curb. Other sections of the roadway, it was right up to the curb. So as we were moving into a design phase for a sidewalk, we really had some work to do in terms of developing a plan that would be acceptable to residents. Because if we crossed a private property, we had to get permission from the property owner, we had to get a construction easement, and we had to get agreement. So it ended up in creating some interesting challenges in terms of the design that I'll go into and have a slide that sort of shows that better. As I mentioned, it had heavy transit use. There were 3 ride-on routes that went through the street, about 21 bus stops in that 1-mile section. One of the things we did was consolidate some bus stops based on ridership use to make them a little more efficient and effective. So we went down from 21 to 16 actual stops. We've also, as a subsequent phase of that project, added bus shelters so that transit users now have a covered spot. The other component of the project is the roadway itself had no stormwater infrastructure. Fairly, as you know, a very well-developed area. Multifamily buildings, single-family properties, commercial buildings, parking lots, a lot of impervious surface along the roadway. One side of the street drains to Long Branch Creek. The other side of the street drains to Sligo Creek Parkway. There were just 2 inlets and one pipe system through the entire expanse of that 1-mile roadway. So stormwater treatment, water quality improvement, it was basically left to the drainage patterns in the roadway itself. This is kind of an example of a couple of the issues we dealt with. When you look at this drawing, it shows you some of the challenges. For instance, the blue sidewalk, and this is a proposed plan. It changed a little from the actual construction, but the blue line is the proposed sidewalk. Those yellow marks are the driveway aprons that are currently existing. Any of the green areas are initial stormwater bioretention facilities. And if you see those red lines, they indicate the private property boundaries. So this slide shows an example on the one side here of, you can see that one property where the private property boundary goes all the way to the curb. So if we were going to put a sidewalk across that private property, we had to get a construction easement and permission. On the south side, there was an existing 4 feet wide sidewalk that was already in place. So the main plan there was to improve ADA compliance, make sure sidewalk was level across driveways, and then we also were taking a look at that traffic calming component. So you see there at the intersection a bump out that narrows the crossing distance for pedestrians, as well as narrows the roadway and provides some traffic calming. So those were some of the features that we looked at when we were moving into design. Oops, wrong direction. The goal of the project was to provide a green street. We were motivated by information we received from others and wanted to kind of make our mark in Takoma Park on a green street. This sort of seemed like an ideal situation. The length of the street, the type of properties along the roadway, and the opportunities that might be available for us in terms of improving existing condition. So first and foremost, we wanted to increase energy efficiency. There were street lights on the street, a total of 49, so we did an LED street light conversion. They were previously high pressure sodium. We also installed a pedestrian level lighting, which I'll show in a slide, couple of lanes slides down, which improved the ambiance and aesthetics, as well as pedestrian level lighting for people walking on the sidewalk at night. For pedestrian safety, paramount was adding a new sidewalk on the east side, and we did ADA compliance on the existing sidewalk. We also installed marked crosswalks at the intersections. And again, many of those had been narrowed with the bump outs to reduce the crossing width. Traffic calming was another big issue. The bump out served as traffic calming to slow the traffic. Also, in response to the residents' request, we added additional stop signs, not technically considered traffic calming, but they did slow traffic in terms of getting sort of the right pace for the road. You know, what they say is you can kind of design a road to impact and affect the way people drive it. So if you drove on Flower Avenue before, it was just sort of like a free-for-all. You could sort of gun it and go. Now, the stop signs, the bump outs, the trees, the sidewalks, it really makes you sort of stop and consider and drive the roadway at an appropriate speed. We wanted to promote the use of transit. Obviously, there was a heavy transit use with 3 ride-on bus routes and all the bus stops, but there was no formal bus stop pads or any amenities for bus stop users. So we were able to install bus pads, you know, the concrete bus pads for them to use, as well as benches, trash cans, and now in some cases shelters. And we improved the location of the stops based on ridership numbers. So we were able to work with Ride On, get their data, talk to them about how it could be more effective. You know, sometimes with bus stops there's some frustration if the bus stops on the short side of an intersection and then cars sort of like gun around it, cross the yellow line and get through it. So if we could move those to the past side, it tended to reduce that issue of cars blowing around the bus when it was stopping. So those kinds of decisions were made in conjunction with Ride On. I mentioned we added stormwater management. I've got a slide that goes into a little bit more detail there, and implemented tree planting for a couple of reasons. In addition to the stormwater water uptake, just adding shade and amenities to the area. One of the things we wanted to make sure when you kind of do a project like this, you don't want the utilities to come through and cut everything all up again, mess it all up. So for years, and this project spanned a great number of years. We started planning it really in earnest in 2014. We didn't start constructing it till late 2019 and finished it in 21. Reached out to the utilities time and time again. Have you got anything you need to do here? We know, I mean, Takoma Park, many of your neighborhoods might be the same. A lot of the utilities are very, very old. So the gas service was 80 years old. The water line was 100 years old. So we were really encouraging them, you know, we got this big there. So Washington Gas, after years of saying no, months before we were ready to kick off the project, decided now was the time they wanted to replace the gas main. So we had to delay our project for a while Washington Gas went through. Again, it's one of those things better to do before than after. So while it was frustrating, we were glad they finally paid attention and did it. With WSSC, we actually ended up with a really serendipitous sort of combination. They acknowledged that the water main was old, the water meters need to be replaced, but they didn't have it in the queue for design, and they didn't really have the full level of funding necessary to move the project forward. So in working with the WSSC staff, we said, how about our engineering team design the project to meet your specifications? You review it, you pay for it, and it gets designed as a component of this project. And better still, it'll save us both money, because instead of you having to hire a contractor and going out to bid, we'll hire the contractor, we'll oversee them, we'll do the construction management, and we'll split costs for all those, you know, contract management, site preparation, all that sort of overhead kind of costs you get with projects like that. And in a stroke of genius, WSSC said yes. So we were able to blend these two projects together. It did slow down the design development, but in a way it made it all possible because it reduced costs for the city overall. It provided the needed utility improvement, and it got everything going at once. And then lastly, trees, which is the main focus of this conversation this evening. We did have to remove 12 trees in the scope of the project. Many of those were considered less than good species: Bradford pear, Siberian elm, some Norway spruce. We planted 16 overstory trees at the end of the project once everything was done. Those were all upper canopy, canopy shade producing trees. And tree protection was an integral part of the design and the construction, and I've got some other information to show you about kind of the components that we use for tree protection. Oops. Again, not to spend too much time on this, some design elements. There's the pedestrian level lighting that we used in the project. We did both trash can and benches at our stop signs. Some of the narrowing, the curb extension to reduce the crossing distance. Example there, rain gardens, bioretentions. The top picture there is the prior condition, the existing condition. One side has a sidewalk, the other side just an asphalt path. It was basically a 2-lane road with parking allowed on most one side. And so what we wanted to do in some areas was create a sidewalk on the other side with a green strip of at least 5 feet where we could, allow for the parking lane, and maintain that 2-lane traffic. In those areas where we did bump outs, we eliminated the parking lane, had the 2-lane traffic, and created a bump out and green strip with a sidewalk and a planting area. Stormwater management, just to briefly touch on. We really tried to maximize the amount of stormwater water quality treatment we could get out of the project. Again, when you're sort of clean slate, starting from nothing, you reach for the stars and then see what you can do. So our engineering team identified 14 locations for what's called linear environmental site design, sort of those street side bioretention or stormwater treatment facilities. When they did the perk testing and the evaluation, soil evaluation, they found that only 7 of those would actually perk and work. So our list of 14 got quickly dropped to 7. All those were installed. We were able to work with the university, which owns the property at this end, so we had 2 very large facilities that were installed on the university side, one on each side of the street. In the end, we were able to provide more stormwater treatment that was the minimum required for the project itself, because like with anyone, if you're adding impervious surface, you have to provide treatment based on state regulatory requirements for that. So we knew where the minimum was we wanted to get, but we also hope to utilize this for some additional stormwater treatment, because our city, like most others, has a requirement. Because we have a discharge permit, we have to meet certain requirements for water quality treatment for our impervious area. So we were able to add about 1/4 more than necessary. We would have really liked to add in more, but the soil was working against us in that regard. In terms briefly of project cost, a little over $6,700,000 in project costs. The biggest takeaway here, and it's really attributable to the hard work of the team we put together. We had a special projects coordinator who worked tirelessly on getting grant funding. So about over 81% of the project costs were covered by other people's money. So the city had about $1,241,000 that it invested in this project. I split out the design versus construction management, those numbers there. WSSC had a big portion of that cost, obviously, for their water main and their shared costs with us for the construction management. We were able to get a transportation alternative project grant, a state level grant, for over $1 million. State Highway gave us almost $700,000 when we did the road transfer. So basically, in order for us to take over the road, they said, here's what we would have paid for resurfacing so you guys can use it. And that really provided the seed money for all the design costs that we had. As you can see, our design portion was almost $886,000 all told. We were able to use community development block grant money for some of the improvements, including the benches, the trash cans, the lighting. Montgomery County gave us a whopping $200,000 to put the sidewalk in on the opposite side of the street. And early on, we got a National Fish and Wildlife Federation grant geared towards the stormwater management, and we did some community outreach and tried to encourage people to do stormwater management on their own properties. So we were able to get a National Fish and Wildlife Federation grant through that. So that's sort of as much as I had to present on the Flower Avenue Green Street project. I wanted to now pivot to the city's project on ADA compliance. And then my last piece is to talk about our new sidewalk process. And then happy to take questions at the end of this. I apologize for all the talking. ADA compliance. The city got inspired in 2009. There was a lot of interest on providing better sidewalk access, providing bike lanes. We've made more progress lately on bike lanes, but the initial focus was on pedestrian safety. So we worked with a tool design group to evaluate our existing sidewalk network, where our missing sidewalks were, and to get a sort of a sense of what condition our sidewalks were in citywide. A good portion of our sidewalks are on state roads, but our focus initially was on the sidewalks that are on city streets. So the council kind of decided to jump in about 2010. So we've been actively working on this ADA compliance project for 12 years. The goal is to ensure sidewalks are in compliance with federal and state rules and to enhance walkability and safe access to schools and other locations. So our goal was to start on city roads and make sure that existing city sidewalks that are already in place were compliant and passable and adequate for safe walking. Progress to date, these are some numbers based on the tool design evaluation. They rated our sidewalks and split them into 3 tiers. To tell you the truth, I can't even remember what the 3 tiers were. I think it had to do with complexity of getting compliance, like which ones were easy were tier 1, which ones a little more complicated, tier 2, and the ones that were going to be a real challenge, tier 3. So again, we've been at it for 12 years. We're about 86% complete with the existing sidewalks on city roads. So I'm really happy with that progress. We still have more to go. We've learned a lot in the process of how we do ADA compliance along city streets. So annually, the allocation for this has ranged from the year 1, we had $800,000. So it was a big banner year. We sort of kicked off and went to it. The next year, the program stalled for a year when we had some political pressure. People were really unhappy about why we're spending money on sidewalks. And so funds got frozen, and then we kicked into gear again. So all told, over the past 12 years, we spent about $5 million on existing sidewalk renovations. This slide, again, I apologize for the size, but I did want to sort of get into a little bit of how we do our ADA compliance work on sidewalks. Key to that is before we start work, we've partnered with an engineering firm. They walk the sidewalk before we bring out the backhoes and the excavation equipment. And they literally have a 4-foot level, and they check every section of sidewalk square by square. So they're identifying where the trip hazards are, where the cracks are, where the cross slopes are inadequate or too steep, where we've got driveway apron issues, where we've got other problems. And then they paint, it looks like a graffiti nightmare. They paint and mark up the sidewalk before our concrete contractor gets on site. So they identify sort of the scope of the non-compliance issues within a sidewalk. And then they stay on site through the construction. So we have a certified engineer who's there evaluating everything that our construction crew is doing through the work of sidewalk design. And that's really the only way to make sure that the curb ramps are installed correctly, that the cross slopes hold and you don't end up with anything too steep. that the issue of crossing people's driveways or lead walks gets resolved. So it's really ended up being very, very helpful and a very good way to do the work. And now we've had the same concrete contractor as well as the same engineering firm for the whole time. We've used different engineers at the time, but we have an established process. They know what we're doing, and it's been really able to move quite smoothly and effectively. So we do have some basic requirements. We use state highway guidelines for ADA compliance, and then we kind of citified it. We turned it into what would work for us when we're doing our work. First and foremost, we wanted the existing city sidewalks to match current conditions. Most of those were 4 feet wide. If they were wider, we kept them wider. We're allowed to do pinch points around certain restrictions, poles, or other obstructions, but only for a minor amount of space. For most new sidewalks, your cross slope has to be 2% or less if you're installing brand new. We determined that if we did that in the city, we'd be pulling up every section of sidewalk because nothing is 2%. So we set our own sort of guideline of less than 5%. So if that cross slope, and do you know what I mean by cross slope? Side to side, sort of the tilt, not the running length of the sidewalk, but sort of the side to side. So basically you want a flat surface. So anyone with difficulties walking or is using a mobile walker or wheelchair, it doesn't have the challenges of dealing with that cross slope issue. So we set a minimum of less than 5%. So if a cross slope exists that's 5% or more, it gets removed and replaced. A lot of times, especially in existing neighborhoods like ours, sidewalk over a driveway is like a ski slope. You don't really think about it until you try to walk on it, or if you have difficulty, or if you're in a wheelchair. Oftentimes 10% and more. So almost without exception, the big work is putting a level sidewalk in across the driveway, which means that you then have to change the driveway apron and then address the slope of the driveway going up. So we have as a maximum slope that we'll do on any driveway apron is 20%. We really hope that it's less. Keep cars from bottoming out in those kinds of situations. We have had cases where we've had to go back and adjust it as people's cars bottom out. If a sidewalk's cracked heaver as a joint, it gets replaced. Curb ramps at the intersections all have to have detectable warnings. That's a federal standard, and no more than a slope of 8% going up from the curb ramp. And also it has to have the level landing area. Oftentimes what that means is for existing areas like ours that are already developed, you're lowering the sidewalk at the curb, at the corner, in order to meet that compliance issue at the curb ramp. So that sometimes triggers a bunch of issues with back curbs, people's retaining walls. It ends up being kind of a challenge to manage all that. Another question that comes up to us oftentimes, particularly from folks who aren't really happy with us doing sidewalk work, is, hey, this street is steep, it's not compliant, it's more than 8%. What are you doing messing with the sidewalk on our street? Well, based on state and federal regulation, if your sidewalk matches the slope of the street, it's compliant. As long as you're not changing the elevation or grade, as long as you're matching the slope of the street. So even on the cases where a street is very steep, you can still put an ADA compliant sidewalk in, providing you're not exceeding the slope of the street itself. And again, oftentimes what we find is that sidewalks will sometimes get depressed and the curb raised, years of resurfacing the street, replacing the curb and gutter. You end up with a sort of trench of a sidewalk that just kind of gathers dirt and water and ponding. So anytime we get those situations, we elevate the sidewalk so that it's above the height of the curb so that water will now drain off and into the street. And that can be a big challenge with residents who suddenly have like a lead walk or a step or their driveway apron that's going to get elevated 4 to 6 inches. So it's a real conversation with residents and their property when we're elevating sidewalk that for decades has been lower than the curb. But the end result is that everything drains correctly. You don't have trip hazards, you don't have ponding water, and that's really the goal. And related to the tree issues again, as this work is done, the city has an urban forest manager. They're on site both before and during as well as after the project. So they make sure that what the contractor's doing is in compliance with the goals. If there's tree removals that have to happen, but more importantly, if there's tree protection that has to happen. And I'll pivot now into next slide, I believe, is sort of our tree protection measures related to both new and ADA sidewalks. Last point I wanted to make is oftentimes people will have sump pumps or downspouts that drain from their house and kind of discharge onto the sidewalk. Again, that can create a problem. Summertime moss and algae and whatever, wintertime ice. And so in any of those cases, we'll capture their drain line, put them under the sidewalk and out through the curb, or even better, if there's a stormwater utility nearby into the inlet, we'll add the pipe and connect it. But we want to make sure that water gets off the sidewalk and out into the street. Wanted to say just a bit about our tree protection guidelines, and again, this is developed by our city's urban forest manager. A lot of detail here. I won't need to go into it. Happy to send this to you, but if people have specific questions about the tree protection measures that we take, I'm happy to go through it. First and foremost, there's some critical things. One is anytime we're near a tree, we're going to do hand excavation. We're not going to let our contractor use their mechanical means, their excavators to do it. It's all been done with shovels and hands. There's certain areas around trees that are identified for tree protection. We also use an alternative surface, so we're not putting concrete back in some areas where there's trees. We use a surface called perky pave. There's also a flexi pave. It's basically a rubber and asphalt mix with an emulsifier. That benefits a couple of ways. One is water is able to drain through it, oxygen is able to drain through it, so it's not the impervious surface that concrete represents. The other interesting thing about it is it oftentimes can be done at lesser depth than concrete. Usually if you're going to do a concrete sidewalk, your sidewalks are going to be 4 inches deep, and then you've got to do a base and compaction below that, so you're really affecting about 8 inches of grade below the top of the sidewalk. So with the flexi pave, you can do much less. It's usually 4 inches. There's usually 2 inches of something called 57 stone, and then 2 inches of perky pave. So you can either elevate it up and over the roots, or you don't have to do quite the same amount of excavation, particularly if there's an existing sidewalk. You can just pop up what's up there. You don't disturb the roots below. You can put the perky pave on top. When we first started doing this in 2010, 11, 12, there was no perky pave, there was no flexi pave. We were using bricks. Bricks don't hold very well. If any of you have ever tried to do a herringbone pattern of bricks on your lead walk, they're going to move, they're going to raise, they're going to elevate, you're going to have trip hazards. So our next phase of work will be going back to all the places we put bricks for permeable pavement on sand base and replace it with the perky pave. So it's really a surface that works. The downside of it is it's quadruple the cost of concrete. So it's much more expensive, but at the same time, it serves a very specific purpose. You wouldn't want to do a whole sidewalk perky pave. You probably couldn't afford it. But based on our criteria, as you can see there, 1/2 foot for each 1 inch of zone of the tree. So on either side of the tree, we'll do the perky pave based on the diameter of the tree and extend out on either side. Usually it's about 12 to 16 feet on either side of the tree that we're installing. Next topic I wanted to get into was our new sidewalk design. Again, those tree protection measures that were on the previous slide are in place, whether it's ADA compliance with existing sidewalks or new sidewalks. To some degree, when you're working with existing sidewalks, it's a little clearer, but both need tree protection measures. Both need evaluation for relocation of the sidewalk to give space around a tree if necessary. We've oftentimes bumped a sidewalk into the street to go around a tree, so we're not really stuck on sort of the straight line approach to sidewalks, because we sort of feel like that that variation in the curb line can also serve a function for traffic calming. In some cases, providing you do it right and it's well signed and you're not surprising people. You don't want to have a curb jump out in the middle of a drive lane. But if otherwise it's a protected parking lane and you could bump the sidewalk out and the curb, then there's sort of multiple benefits for that. Just have a couple more slides here. Our new sidewalk process, I mean, I've worked for the city for a long time. Started in the late 80s. We didn't build any new sidewalks. We were sort of like, if somebody wanted a new sidewalk, we were kind of like, I don't know. And there was much more pressure and conversation about it in the city. And in 2015, that then city council finally established a resolution which basically said we're going to create a process for new sidewalks in the city. A process for how it gets started and what happens once a request is made. And of course, if you know anything about Takoma Park, nothing if not community input, a lot of conversation, a lot of meetings. So the process is very much a community organizing sort of effort. The initial process, for instance, with traffic calming in the city is you've got to get a petition signed by 2/3 of the people affected. With the sidewalk, they decided to get away from that petition process, and basically you can initiate a new sidewalk request in the city very simply. You can get your council member to ask for it, or the city council as a whole can ask for it, or the city manager on behalf of the city departments can ask for it, or any resident or community group can ask for it. So pretty much no more petition, you just got to make a request. Once we get a formal written request, the next process is that we set up a community meeting with what we determine is the affected area. And the affected area is defined in the resolution, in the regulations, as both sides of the block where the sidewalk's proposed, as well as blocks on either end. If it's more than a single block, you can have blocks on either side. So that amount of the existing area, as well as one block of the cross streets. So that's defined as the affected area. So all our communication, our letters, our notices, our community meeting flyers, they all go to that defined affected area. And so once we get a request, we do an initial meeting that basically describes what I'm describing to you, to the residents. Here's the process. Here's what we do from here. And then the first thing is there's a vote, a community vote of the affected area. Do you want a city to spend money on design? So that same affected area gets to vote as to whether or not they want to move to design. If 50% or more of the responses are positive, yes, we think the city should go to design, then it gets put in the design queue. And from there, we hire an engineering firm to do surveys of the property boundary and the right-of-way boundary, basically trying to determine where we have room for a sidewalk, and then to develop the design options. And then once that gets developed, we start a series of community meetings to review that. For some simple sidewalks, it can be 2 or 3 meetings. For other very complicated sidewalk process, it can take many, many more. So it's sort of an iterative process where we initially provide some options, get feedback, make adjustments based on people's comments. And then once we sort of hit what we think is the final design, and that's a little bit of a subjective term because it doesn't mean that everybody's happy with it, right? We oftentimes have people that are really unhappy with it. But once we've kind of answered all the questions we had, made the best design we have it pretty clear, selected the side, selected the impacts, we sort of call it at some point and say, hey, this really is the final design. And once we're there, then we do the next vote process, which again, the affected residents can vote on, and if we get 50% of the responses back, that are, yes, we want to move forward with construction, then the project moves into the construction queue. And this is my last slide, but we do have some sort of criteria that's established in the resolutions and the regulations that was passed by the city for this process. So they do try to have some sort of overarching principles. They're not hard and fast, but they're trying to provide guidelines and sort of a sense of what's, in the scale of things, what's more important than another. So right off the bat, we put it in the right-of-way if we have right-of-way. If we don't have right-of-way, it's a very complicated process of getting permission from property owners to construct across their property. If there's any way to kill a sidewalk, that is certainly a way to kind of nip it in the bud. If the roadway width is adequate, we're encouraged to put the sidewalk in the roadway if there's space, for a couple of reasons. One, it has a lower stormwater impact, as well as it has lower private property impact. It was already a curb and roadway, so nobody really has as much feeling about putting a sidewalk there than their established garden bed that they've had for 20 years behind the curb. So when it's possible, if the roadway's wide enough, we look at putting it in the road. We minimize tree removal to the extent possible. Our design engineers are doing tree surveys, so they not only identify where the trees are, but also the condition of the tree, the species of the tree, those kinds of things, so we can sort of evaluate the tree impacts. There are some trees, invasive species, or ones that are not quite doing so well, that are less painful to remove than ones that are, big, healthy, wonderful overstory oaks that you wouldn't want to take down. So there are factors in the evaluation. The city has a really rigorous tree removal process and permit for private property owners, so we apply that to ourselves. So the city requires tree replanting, and it's not a one-for-one replanting. It's based on the size of the tree. So there's a formula that's used. If you've got a 26-inch, healthy oak that you're taking down, it's going to be 4 to 5 to 6 tree replacements as a result of that. The formula is actually based on this goal of getting the same canopy 25 years in the future from the tree you're removing. So they're trying to make sure you replace the canopy of that existing tree within 25 years. And there's some science behind that in terms of, you can't really plant large diameter trees and expect them to survive. So sort of the sweet spot is about 1.5 inch caliper tree. So we focus on 1.5 inch caliper tree and determine how many of those needs to be replanted in order to replace the tree that's being removed. When we have cases where we're affecting people's lead walks, their retaining walls, their vegetation, their special slate, whatever, we have a lot of that in the right-of-way. So right off the bat, we say that's a project cost. So if we have to remove your lead walk, or if we have to adjust your driveway, or if we have to push back your retaining wall, that's not on the private property to do. That's part of the project cost. So that gets included. However, we have sort of set we have a pretty basic standard. For instance, if we have retaining walls, they're concrete retaining walls. I know I've seen the county do some imbricated stone and other types of retaining walls. Currently, our process is just we're building concrete retaining walls if they're needed. Our stormwater treatment is going to be required based on the city code, which again is that in most of our areas it's considered developed, so we're using redevelopment criteria. So we have to treat 50% of the runoff from the 2-year storm. So we have that same requirement for ourselves as any private property owner would if they were adding impervious surface. And of course, the sidewalk width has to meet or exceed ADA requirements. Lately, I've had a bunch of sidewalks with fairly narrow roads, and people really want us to put in these 3-foot sidewalks. And our policy is no, we don't do 3-foot sidewalks unless there's some reason. There's a tree or there's some limited space we need to go around. But otherwise, we want 5-foot wide sidewalks because those are the sidewalk width that people can most comfortably walk on. And then lastly, when we can, and again, our city is pretty well developed, but there's a preference for a green strip between the sidewalk and the street. Not always able, but we sort of start with that as a goal. If we can fit a green strip in, for a couple of reasons. One, it's a potential small tree spot. It also gives some distance between the pedestrian and the cars. And then lastly, and we might have some here on Thursday, if there's ever a snow event, right? So our plows are coming through and pushing snow up. We're not covering the sidewalk. We've got a little bit of margin there to provide a distance. So those are sort of criteria that we have across the board. And that's pretty much the end of my presentation. Happy to take questions and sort of if there's anything more you want me to go back to or had any thoughts about.
On your 50% residents voting, say there's a apartment house on the block or renters, so each of those apartment units would be counted as one resident.
Right.
Like, it doesn't matter if there's 5 people living in one house or, one in one house.
Yeah.
They each count for one vote.
The way we've determined it at this point is per household. So if you're considered in the same household, husband and wives can't vote each other out. You just get one. But if you're a garden apartment or accessory apartment, each of those can vote. And to the degree we can, we try to identify that on the tax rolls. So the letter we're sending out goes to all the property owners. Sorry?
The letter goes to the property owner or to the tenant?
To the resident. Yep. Sure.
Flower Avenue project. Now, where is it cover on Flower Avenue again?
What section?
Yeah.
It's between Carroll Avenue and Piney Branch Road. So it's a 1 mile portion between those two.
It's all?
Yep. Yeah,
I only think there's one bus route that goes through there.
Oh, there's 3. Yeah, 3 ride-on routes that go through Flower Avenue. Yep.
During rush hour or something?
Yeah, throughout the day. Yep.
Primarily, most of Flower Avenue is 12, and that's it.
Yeah, I don't know the bus numbers again. I didn't. It's been a while since I've looked at it, but yeah, there's 3 ride-on routes that go through there.
Eliminated, so that's not where they eliminated from the routes. Further down toward where university is, they eliminated routes around there. Stops, I mean. Yeah, we did end up, we had 21 stops on the 1 mile stretch, and there are now 16. So they did combine and adjust some of the route stops. More stops.
Yeah.
Pre-pandemic, Montgomery County installed about a mile sidewalk in the Kent Mill subdivision connecting points of congregation by block as to whether there would be sidewalk frontage or not. Can you say anything more generally about Montgomery County's sidewalk policy versus what you've explained to us about Takoma Park City?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't really know the details of Montgomery County's policy. I know we look to them for some of their guidelines and standards, particularly for traffic calming, in terms of distance between speed humps and roadway width and those kinds of things. But I don't know the detail on their sidewalk requirements. I know a critical piece for us is whether or not there's existing right-of-way. And if you have existing right-of-way with space available, makes it much easier to install a sidewalk than when you don't. So that's kind of first thing to figure out, sort of who owns the land, and then that really guides the rest of the process. Yeah.
Can you talk about why at the intersections there's only one of the 4 crosswalks marked?
Yeah, it varies in intersection to intersection, but typically we try to pair it with the bus stop location. So that's where the primary amount of people we're going to be crossing, either from the bus off across the street or to get to the bus. So there were some locations that were identified as just sort of two sides of the four-sided crosswalk. There are some that ended up being all four sides. But we're trying to kind of strike a balance between focusing pedestrian use and getting cars, through the street. So, that's one of those things where you sort of watch and see if you've achieved what you need to achieve, or if there's more. And usually there tends to be a side that's more heavily used than the other. I'm sure there's some cases where it's not, and all sides are used equally heavily, and then those are the ones that you start seeing the four-sided crosswalk box.
Some of them, though, you end up where the pedestrian has to end up crossing 3 times, say, to get from the bus stop to, say, Kennebec and Flower to the other side. And it can be a little awkward.
Yeah. Well, in our case, in that section that's in Takoma Park, we really tried to tie it with the bus stop so that you wouldn't have to cross the street to get to the bus stop. Your cross would be right at the bus stop exit or entrance point. Yeah, not familiar with the Kent Mill.
Do you have a process for when residents can apply to get a crosswalk marked? Is that part of it?
We don't have really good formal standards for that. We kind of do have it sort of you can make a request. Most of the crosswalks in Takoma Park are not marked. Where you start seeing marked crosswalks is really where the state roads exist, and so that's sometimes a challenge because we don't have authority there and we have to go to state highway. State highway has very restrictive standards for what they'll use for determining where a crosswalk location is. So it ends up being areas where we have school routes that are identified, sort of the walking path for schools, or where there's pedestrian generators, commercial areas, or a community center or a rec center, and then we tend to have crosswalks more heavily installed across those. But in our city, really a lot of those heavy pedestrian areas are state highways, which really have a very restrictive approach to marking crosswalks.
We have 2 questions from our Facebook audience.
Oh, okay.
One is about the vegetation and how do you maintain and keep that clear, and the other is the median time between your sidewalk request to the installation.
Oh, good questions. In terms of vegetation maintenance, I'm very happy to have what we call a neighborhood services division, our code enforcement folks. So when we have vegetation issues, vegetation overgrowing a sidewalk, they will give kind of a courtesy notice to the residents that say, hey, you got 30 days to clear this. Your vegetation is overgrowing the sidewalk. So we do kind of a friendly approach. And then if the time passes and it's not addressed, then they get the sort of more, you really have to do this kind of notice. In the cases where it's city right-of-way and it's a city tree, we don't tend to have vegetation from the city right-of-way affecting the sidewalk, but there are times where we need to prune up or limb up trees or address trees. So our urban forest managers kind of doing constant analysis of those areas. In terms of the length of time, it really depends. For instance, we're in construction right now, and we rarely do winter concrete, but we're doing it this year because we had such a slow start to our construction season this year. But that project came in middle of last year, so a little more than a year from beginning to end in terms of the project installation or the sidewalk installation. Right behind it is another group and again, the pandemic really threw this whole thing into kind of a wrench in the works, so it really slowed things down. But we have one group where we're doing both a combination sidewalk and traffic calming project. They entered the queue in early, it was 2019, like the fall of 2019. We just finally got through that process and we're ready to build. Now it's a question of funding. So hopefully it'll get built this summer. But that's that's like a 3-year process for that particular community. In that case, we had a lot of challenges in the project, a lot of people unhappy about it, a lot of back and forth with the design. So some of it depends on how simple the sidewalk design is to move forward. And then, of course, funding is always an issue. So year to year, I don't know what I'm going to get. I know what I ask for. I try to have at least a $500,000 budget for new sidewalk design, and ideally $500,000 for ADA. And that amount has gone up and down, as referenced by the slide, year to year. So sometimes we can get more done than others. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see these looking at what you said about the grading requirements for the crosswalk, for the sidewalk at an intersection or for the crosswalk. I see now, it's in Montgomery County, but you say you're using the same requirements. There's like these mazes of little things that are really
back curbs, yes,
and nearly impossible if you're on a bicycle.
Yeah.
It really is like an obstacle course. And it seems to me that could be avoided by using raised crosswalks on the road, which also is much more effective as traffic calming even than a curb out.
Yeah.
Have you looked at raised crosswalks?
We do. We do install raised crosswalks. With our raised crosswalks, unfortunately, the gutter line, the curb line, still has to be at the grade of the road. So the raised crosswalk itself is only between the curb and not extended into the curb ramp of the sidewalk and the curb ramp down. So we still have that issue, and it's primarily related to drainage. So you've got to get roadway drainage.
Put like a plate over the
Well, we do have one. If you've ever been on Takoma Avenue near Montgomery College, we do have one raised speed table, I guess you'll call it. We won't do another one, but it has metal plates on the side. Constant nightmare of maintenance. You've got to clean out the leaves, keep the flow going. It's just, it's really difficult when you try to move water through a constrained space. And so usually what that ends up being is, you keep the gutter line at its elevation and you do the raised crosswalk between it. But I do share your concern, and I think we haven't got there yet because oftentimes with the curb ramps you end up with these back curbs which are hard corners and strong curbs, and they're narrow. And so you're going from one confined space to another, and I've certainly experienced it on a bike. And so the only solution there is to make it wider, so you've got a little more room. But right now, between grade elevations and trying to hold soil and trying to maintain, the other thing you have to do based on regulatory requirements is have your level landing area. So you need to have that clearly identified and established. So there are some challenges with existing conditions, but I think over time we'll figure it out. We'll get better and better. But I agree, right now there's oftentimes curb ramps are in a maze, especially when you've got grade changes and the ground around it at a higher or lower elevation to the sidewalk itself. Yeah.
Okay, so this will be our last question.
So on Flower, you need to, when you cross Carroll, you need to climb a stick.
Oh, God, yes. Anybody who wants to ride State Highway and rail at them for that, sadly enough, State Highway is doing a street restoration project on Carroll Avenue between the DC line and University Boulevard, and we've been clamoring for this for practically a decade. So it's close, it's coming, and it doesn't include improvements to that intersection. So it can make you nuts. But yes, we have an ADA, in case none of you have ever been there, we have an ADA compliant pedestrian signal that you have to walk up 3 steps to get to. It's like, you couldn't make this stuff up if you tried. And the other side of the intersection has no pedestrian signal across a one of those turn lanes, and you have to cross the turn lane at risk of getting hit by a car to get to the ped signal in the median, so you can push the other. So that the Flower Carroll intersection is a nightmare. We could do a whole other presentation on how to work with State Highway, and I would be in the audience trying to learn from other people about how's the best approach. You know, we push where we can, and you try to build long-term relationships with the staff there and make sure you keep at it and make sure their projects you are in the queue. But yeah, it can be a real challenge. Yeah.
All right, any final burning questions?
Mike?
Okay, real quick, if the city of Takoma Park theoretically, of their own volition, determined as part of the sidewalk, hey, we don't think this is ADA compliant, we will build and approve on the sidewalk, you still gotta go through the voting process with the affected residents?
The voting process is related to new sidewalks, so not the ADA compliant piece. So yeah, if it's ADA compliant, we're there whether they like it or not. And as you can imagine, there's plenty of times where people do not like it. But we don't have any, we do community meetings and we try to give information, and we do individual meetings about how it's going to affect your property personally, but we don't have the vote or anything else. That's related to where there's no existing sidewalk and we're actually trying to construct one. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Nice to talk with you all. Mm-hmm.
Everybody can stack their chair on that rack, that would be a great help. Thank you all, and our next meeting is January 10th.
Right.
That will be the actual vote for our new slate, and do we have our program set? Not quite.
We are hoping to get a presentation on the
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Oh, thank you. It was a treat. It was a lot of fun. Whoops. Yes. Get my mic. There you are.